America, a true superpower. This is a political commentary. This book explores controversial question: is America truly a superpower of freedom, or has power often been exercised in ways that serve financial and geopolitical interests more than democratic ideals? Beginning with the Marshall Plan after World War II, the narrative examines a series of historical moments where the United States intervened in weaker nations under the banners of democracy, anti-communism, or was it for national security? Through fictionalized storytelling blended with historical reflection, the book follows the idea that power, economics, ideology, and global influence often intersect in complex ways. It challenges readers to ask whether the actions of superpowers are driven primarily by values or by strategic advantage. Rather than offering simple answers, the book invites readers to question the nature of power, influence, and narratives nations tell about themselves. Chapter 1, The Marshall Plan, Rebuilding Europe, or was it building influence? In the summer of 1947, the world was still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War. Cities across Europe lay in ruins, factories had been bombed into rubble, food shortages were widespread, and millions of people struggled simply to survive the winter. Entire economies had collapsed. Political instability was rising across the continent of Europe, and many feared that chaos would open the door for communism to spread further west from the Soviet sphere. Into this fragile moment stepped George C. Marshall, the United States Secretary of State, and on June 5, 1947, at Harvard University, Marshall delivered a speech that would shape the modern world as we know it. His proposal was simple on the surface. The United States would provide massive financial aid to help rebuild Europe. This proposal became known as the Marshall Plan, officially called the Europe Recovery Program. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States sent more than $13 billion, over $150 billion in today's value, to Western European nations. The money funded the rebuilding of roads, factories, power plants, and housing. It stabilized countries and currencies and revived industrial production. From one perspective, the Marshall Plan was an extraordinary act of generosity. A victorious nation chose not to punish the defeated, but instead rebuild them. And by them, I mean the Western sphere of Europe. The policy stood in stark contrast to the aftermath of World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing economic penalties on Germany, penalties many historians believe contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of the Second World War. Had we learned our lesson as the world, or the United States appeared to have just learned from history that there was an advantage? Was it purely altruistic? Instead of revenge, it offered reconstruction. But history is rarely that simple. Behind the humanitarian language of the Marshall Plan, another reality lay, which is strategy. At the time, the global balance of power was shifting rapidly. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had emerged from the war with enormous influence over Eastern Europe. Communist governments were forming across the region. To American policymakers, the fear was clear: if Western Europe remained economically weak, communist movement might gain power through democratic elections. The Marshall Plan was therefore not only about rebuilding Europe, it was about preventing the spread of communism. The strategy aligned with the emerging doctrine of containment, first articulated by American diplomat George F. Kennan. Containment argued that Soviet influence had to be limited wherever possible. That meant economic strength, political stability, and Western alliances were seen as the best defense against communist expansion. In this sense, the Marshall Plan functioned as both aid and geopolitics. The funding did not flow randomly. It was directed toward nations that aligned themselves economically and politically with the Western capitalist system. Countries received the aid were encouraged and sometimes required to open their markets, stabilize their currencies, and integrate their economies with Western trade networks. The Soviet Union and the countries within its sphere of influence were technically invited to participate in the Marshall Plan. However, participation required economic transparency and cooperation that the Soviet leadership rejected. Stalin ultimately forbade the Eastern Bloc countries from accepting the aid. Thus resulted was a divided Europe. Western Europe became economically integrated with the United States, while Eastern Europe remained under Soviet influence. This division hardened over the next decades in what became known as the Cold War, symbolized physically by the Berlin Wall in Germany. Yet the economic results of the Marshall Plan were undeniable. Industrial production in Western Europe increased dramatically, agricultural output rose, living standards improved, and by the early 1950s, much of Western Europe had recovered faster than many economists had predicted. But the United States also benefited. A rebuilt Europe meant stable trading partners for American industries. European countries used much of the Marshall Plan funding to purchase American goods, machinery, technology. American exports surged. At the same time, political alliances deepened. The Marshall Plan helped lay the groundwork for NATO, the military alliance formed in 1949 between the United States, Canada, and Western European nations. In other words, the Marshall Plan strengthened not only Europe, it strengthened American global leadership. Some historians therefore see the program as one of the most successful foreign policy strategies ever implemented in modern history. Others see it as the beginning of a new type of influence, one built not through colonial conquest, but through economic architect. Instead of planting flags in foreign lands, the United States helped build the financial system, trade routes, and political alliances that shaped the post-war world order as we know it. It was influence without formal empire. Yet critics argued that the Marshall Plan marked the movement when American power began to expand beyond its borders through economic leverage. By funding Reconstruction, the United States also positioned themselves as the central engine of the Western world. Supporters counter that this leadership was necessary. Without it, if you argue, Europe might have fallen into political chaos, economic collapse, or worse yet, what they feared, communist domination. Both perspectives hold truth. The Marshall Plan was at once humanitarian, strategic, and economic. It rebuilt nations, prevented instability, strengthened alliances, and advanced American interests. Few policies in history have carried so many consequences at once. It raises a larger question that will echo throughout this book. When powerful nations provide aid, are they acting out of generosity, or are they shaping the world in their own image? In the aftermath of World War II, the United States stepped forward as the architect of a new global order. The Marshall Plan became one of its most powerful tools. Whether it was primarily an act of generosity or a carefully designed strategy of influence remains a matter for debate. But one thing is certain. The Marshall Plan did not just rebuild Europe. It helped build the foundations of American global power as we know them today in 2026. And with that power came a new role, one that the United States would continue to play for decades since the World War II end and the beginning of the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Western Europe. A role not just as a nation, but as a superpower.